So up to this point, we've learned how to use TDD to build out just unit tests to help implement some subcomponents. And then we also moved on to using TDD to build out some integration tests to verify at a higher level our functions or endpoints do what we expect them to do. Now what we can do is we can use an end-to-end testing framework such as Cypress to do further TDD to implement an actual UI. Okay, so what we want to do is, I already have Cypress installed. You just npm install Cypress, and you basically need to set up a folder that looks like this. So inside of fixtures, you're going to have any type of test files. So we have a bad PNG and a good PNG. Inside integration, you have an actual test. Plugins and support are where you can define extra commands that Cypress can use. And then there's like a TS config that allows you to write TypeScript, write Cypress in TypeScript. So that's just some boilerplate setup that I did. Now, I want to let you know that I did spend a lot of time trying to write out this test, right? I started recording a video and I spent like 40, 50 minutes just trying to wrap my head around how to write a proper Cypress test for this, because Cypress isn't my primary testing framework. In all honesty, Cypress follows a very different convention than like Jest. So you have to like go back to the docs and read up on stuff and make sure you're doing stuff properly. It's all a bunch of like promise chaining. So I don't know if this is the proper way to write this Cypress test, but regardless, I went ahead and wrote a test. I didn't really record me writing this test, but we are going to try to implement the functionality using what the test is verifying. So I'm going to walk you through what this test is doing, and then we are going to try to implement using TDD how to implement this endpoint. So very similar to the other tests, what we want to do is we want to kind of use Chrome to load up a browser, to load up a web page that might display an image and some buttons that we can click, right? So the test is saying a user rates the last two thumbnails in the backlog. So we're going to assume that there's two images in this backlog and the user can rate both of them. So what we're doing is, before we run this test, we want to basically copy those fixtures files over to this backlog folder. So I'm copying the good file and the bad file over to the backlogs good and then the backlog bad. So that's very similar to how we did the integration test, where we kind of copied files over into this backlog. And then like the other tests, we are cleaning some stuff up. So after this test suite runs, we want to make sure we don't have files lingering around, which could potentially fail the next run. So I'm just basically running some lower level OS commands to remove these files if they exist. And then I'm passing this additional options here, because if the file doesn't exist for some reason, this is going to crash. So you need to make sure you say fail on non-zero exit of false. I'm kind of disappointed that there's not really a way to deal with files in Cypress. There's a way to write files and read files in Cypress, but there's no way to delete files in Cypress. So that's why I went down this path of just doing lower level operating system commands to move stuff. Now, I don't know how well this will work if you're trying to run this on a Windows machine, but it works well for my Mac, so I'm just going to keep doing it that way. Well, let's move on to the first test. And what we're going to do is we're going to step through these tests one by one and try to implement out the logic. So let's read through this. The first test says a user can see the thumbnail on the page and vote on it via buttons. All right, so we're just basically saying load up a page, verify that there's an image or an element that has an ID of image, verify that it has a source tag or source attribute, and then we are kind of caching that first thumbnail ID so that we can use it later on. You'll see this kind of referenced later on. You can use this as keyword to do that. And then we're saying the source attribute should have either good.png or bad.png inside of the string, right? Matches is how you can do regex against a string. So it's kind of makes sense if you load up the UI, if you have two files in this backlog, one of those two files should be displayed in the UI, okay? And then we also verify that there's an upvote button and a downvote button. So let's try to implement the functionality to make this test pass. And again, if I go back to my test case and try to run this, you will notice that it fails because we can't even go to localhost 8080. So I did actually refactor. If you watched the videos before, this public folder existed, this images folder existed at the top level. I went ahead and moved it into the public folder so that we can host it with Express. And now what we need to do is kind of set Express up so that we can host these static files. So I'm going to go to express.es, and we want to first allow it to host any of the files that are in this public directory. So I can say app.use express.static, and then I think I can just say public. So I think this should do what we want. Go ahead and save this file. And now I should be able to go to localhost. All right, so I'm going to go to localhost 8080, and it's going to say cannot get /, but there should be some images that we could probably get. All right, so let's further verify. If we go back to our code, I'm going to go ahead and make a file inside this public directory called index.html. And I'm going to scaffold out HTML. So I'll just say like hello. We can go back and verify that this is loading. All right, so we should be good in that front. And when we rerun our Cypress test, it actually gets back hello here. Okay, so we're in a better position. The page actually loads and we're not crashing at that point. But it's actually saying it's failing because it can't find an image with a source attribute of good or bad. Let's try to implement that out. So what we're going to need to do is make an image tag. So I'm going to make an image tag like this. And we're not going to give it a source for right now because we need to dynamically change that. And let's give it a script tag. And what we want to do is when this page first loads, we want to fetch a random image. Remember, we have that endpoint that we kind of created with our Express backend. Well, we can use that endpoint to get back a random thumbnail ID. So I'm just going to make a function called const get, or I'm going to say display random thumbnail. And this is going to be an asynchronous function, so make sure you put async here. And we want to make this fetch a random thumbnail and set the source equal to that. So we can say await fetch. We want to hit that endpoint, localhost 8080 /thumbnails /random. That should give us back a random thumbnail. And then we want to basically say get the response, get the JSON. All right, maybe this is actually the text. I'm going to say await response.text. And this should hopefully be the random thumbnail. So I'm going to say random thumbnail ID because in our backend should just be returning some string. And what we need to do is basically get that element here. And I'm going to say document.get element by ID. We need to get our image and we need to change the source equal to, I'll do this, images backlog / this. I think we can just do this. And in fact, since this is all hosted on the same 8080, you really could just do this, I believe, and just do a relative path. And I think that should still do what we want. But let's just verify. We can go back to Cypress and rerun our test. And we should hopefully see an image display if everything is working okay. And it's not doing what we want. So let's just go ahead and go to our network tab over here. And we want to verify that if we run this test, it should be trying to hit our random endpoint. And it doesn't seem to be hitting our random endpoint. So let's kind of go back and try to figure out what's going on. Okay, it's because I haven't actually ran this function, right? I made a function, but I didn't run it. So let's run the function. Let's go back and rerun this test. And we should see it try to hit the random endpoint, which it did. And that gives back a good.png. And then we are displaying that good PNG here directly in the browser. So that test is passing now. It's saying that, hey, we have actually displayed an image that contains the string of good.png or bad.png. So that's passing now. Now we can move on to the next part of the test is we need an upvote button and a downvote button. So let's go ahead and add those. This should be pretty simple to do. I'm going to say button of upvote, and this will just say upvote. And then I'm going to copy and paste that and do a downvote. So if I save this and refresh or rerun our tests, everything passes because we do have an image displayed that matches that regex. We have an upvote button displayed, and we also have a downvote button displayed. So using TDD, we were able to implement our front-end functionality. Everything seems like it's good. So we can move on to the next part of this test. All right, so this one is a user can upvote on the thumbnail, which moves it to the good directory. So if someone clicks on upvote, we basically need to wait a little bit so that the backend can do its processing, and then we test to verify that, hey, there is a file in the good directory now, and that same file that was in the backlog has been deleted. Okay, so these are just lower level operating system commands we're running to verify that the file system reflects what the system should be doing. Now keep in mind that if you have user-facing functionality that we can verify that these files have been moved around, like let's say we have a new UI that displays all the good thumbnails, or a new UI that shows all the backlog thumbnails, or all the bad thumbnails, you don't need to do this lower level like operating system stuff. You should probably be hitting those public-facing endpoints or hitting those user interfaces to verify that things have been changing. But since we are not implementing those right now, we're just going to check the operating system. This might be a little dirty, but it works. And a little recap, remember we're accessing first thumbnail ID because we are caching that thumbnail ID that comes back from the backend inside a variable here, which you can access if you have a function keyword. You can just access it like this. So that's how we're doing that. And we also have a helper function that basically gets the last part of a URL, because that is basically what source is going to look like. But anyway, okay, so let's try to run this test and see what happens. It'll probably fail because we haven't implemented anything. All right, so this one is failing. User can upvote on the thumbnail. So right now it's because we don't have any functionality on the upvote button. So let's go back to our UI and we're going to say document.getElementById. We're going to say upvote. We can add an event listener. So when someone clicks it, we can basically just do something. Okay, and what we want to do is we want to fetch, or we want to do that post request to tell the backend that, hey, the user voted this thumbnail as good. All right, so let's just go ahead and do another Axios request. I'm going to say fetch. I'm going to do that endpoint. I'm going to say, oops, thumbnails. I need to get the thumbnail ID kind of put in here. And I'm going to say, let's see, thumbnail ID. And I need to change these to backtick so that we can interpolate that. So the first thing you'll notice is that we haven't cached the thumbnail ID. So let's just go ahead and pull this out here, and we're going to remove that from const, and we're going to access that thumbnail ID right here. So that'll allow us to actually upvote on that thumbnail ID. Now remember, this endpoint is a post request. So I'm going to say method is post, and then headers, we have to say application of JSON for the content type. So I'm going to say content type is application/JSON, so the backend knows to process the body. And then we also need to pass that a body. If you remember, the backend is expecting some JSON, and the body needs to have an is good of true or false. All right. So let's just await on this. At this point, this should do a request to the backend, vote that thumbnail as good, and then what we want to do is just verify that that file has been moved. So let's just go ahead and rerun this and see what happens. Await is only valid on asynchronous functions, so I need to make sure that I put async here. And let's go back and verify that if we rerun our test, it should do something. Okay, that one's passing now. So it's saying that everything is working. The image has been moved or deleted from the good/bad directory. In fact, it should have probably removed those files. Why did it not remove good of bad? Okay, so I think I have some logic that I need to add to here, because the bad file could go to good, or the good file could go to bad, since this is random. So let's just go ahead and do that. Just make sure you clean up everything after the test runs. Let me run it one more time just in case. We're still passing, but I just wanted to clean up those extra files that were laying around. If you know a better way for doing this, let me know. But it works. I could probably abstract this to a helper function called like delete file, but whatever. Yeah, so let's move on to the test still, and let's make sure that we're not missing anything. So the test is passing, and the implementation is doing exactly what we want. So we can probably move on to this next test scenario that I've written. It says a user sees a thumbnail. It says user sees a new thumbnail on the screen, right? So basically, the UI needs to reload a new thumbnail, not just display the old one that we're looking at. So this is saying get the image, check the source, make sure that it has a different thumbnail ID. So check that the second thumbnail ID is not equal to the first thumbnail ID. So if I went ahead and ran this test, it's failing because it's showing the exact same thumbnail as we did when we first voted on it. So we need to go back and implement some changing logic here. to basically change this image to be a brand new random thumbnail that we haven't seen before. So how do you do that? Well, we could just rerun this little function that we wrote. So I'm going to go down here and just run that. And that should hopefully fix this test. All right, so you saw that the image was one thing and then it changed. So let's just run this again. Really focus on this image here. You'll see that it changes real quick. All right, so the next thing we need to verify is the downvote button. We have another test case to verify that. So if we uncomment this one, we are basically saying user downvotes a thumbnail, which moves it to the bad directory. So it's very similar to that other test case with the upvote, but instead we're clicking on a downvote button. So let's go ahead and save this, run the test, and verify that it fails. All right, so it's failing. It's saying that, hey, it expected this good thumbnail to exist, but it didn't. So that is failing because we haven't implemented what happens when someone clicks on the downvote button. So let's just copy and paste this whole block here. And we could basically just change this to downvote. And we want to say as good as false here. And we still want to display a random image. All right, so very, very similar to this one, just, setting false instead. Let's go back and run our test and see if it all passes. All right, everything's good. The directory is now empty, or the file is now in the correct location. Now you'll notice the UI is actually displaying an undefined image here because there's no more items in the backlog. So there's a final test that I wrote to verify that the user should no longer see any thumbnails because the backlog is empty. So I could have maybe just checked using like a sci-exec command to verify that the backlog is empty, but I figured this is good enough. Just get the image, check the source, and make sure that it is equal to an empty string. So there is no thumbnail ID because the backend can't find any more images. Let's save this one and go ahead and rerun our test. And now everything's passing. So we have successfully wrote a Cypress test using test-driven development. I didn't really write this live because, as you can tell, it's a little bit complicated and it took me a long time to kind of refresh my memory on all these commands. So I apologize for that, but they're here if you want to reference them and kind of learn about how to do some of this stuff. But now at this point, we have an actual working integration test or end-to-end test that we can start refactoring our code if we wanted to. So all of this code is kind of duplicated. We could dry this up. So I'm going to make another function here called like vote on thumbnail. And that's going to be a function that says like is good. And really what we could do is just call these two methods and abstract away the is good argument. Okay, so we could just say vote on thumbnail here, await on it, and this is going to be true. And now this one, when you click on the downvote button, you're just going to pass false. So let's double check that this is actually working. If we go back to our tests, we can rerun them. And they are failing. Await is only valid. I think I need to add an async somewhere. I probably need to add it here. All right, so display random thumbnail. We should probably await on this as well. Anyway, so yeah, let's try rerunning the tests. Everything works. Refactor that a little bit. That looks a lot cleaner. Could this be refactored at all? Probably could. I don't think we technically need to put since we're using the same URL, we don't need to put that like localhost stuff. So I'm just going to try to rerun this and see if it still passes. All right, so without actually touching Chrome, the only time I touched Chrome was to make sure this Hello World page loaded, but without touching Chrome, we were able to implement a real functionality for this application all the way through, basically, to verify that we have an app that works, that the user can actually use. And on top of that, we have a ton of tests that verify that this application does what it needs to do, so that if I come back later and refactor or change anything, I'll know what I broke. So just to show you, I can go and grab those images, which are in the fixtures folder. I'm going to paste them in our backlog. And now going into Chrome, instead of going into Cypress, I can upvote these or downvote these if I want to. I'm going to say downvote, and I'm going to say downvote. The app works exactly like we saw with the Cypress runner. We have two files inside this bad directory now, and everything is working as we wanted it to. All right, so I hope you enjoyed watching this. This is going to wrap up this tutorial series. I showed you how to do TDD to write unit tests. I showed you how to use TDD to write integration tests. And then I showed you how you can use TDD to write out Cypress tests to implement an actual user interface that interacts with our backend. Again, sorry that I kind of just gave you a bunch of code and uncommented it, but this stuff was crazy. So if you enjoyed this, give me a thumbs up. Also, be sure to leave a comment below if you have a different approach you like to use TDD for. And like always, if you're new to this channel, be sure to subscribe because I'm going to have other videos like this that should hopefully help you become a better web developer in the future.